Welcome back to Park Ranger Files. Tonight, every story of this compilation comes from West Virginia, specifically from the small villages, the rural communities, the places where the same families have been on the same land for generations. When people who grew up in places like that tell you something is wrong, you listen. Story 1. I want to start by saying that I grew up not far from Helvetia. For those who don't know, Helvetia is this tiny little Swiss settlement tucked way back in the hills of Randolph County, West Virginia. Population maybe 50 people, if you count the goats. It's the kind of place that feels like it belongs in a different century. Old hand-built farmhouses. A little restaurant run out of somebody's home kitchen. A rathskeller where they still play fiddle on weekends. My grandmother used to drive us out there for the Fasnacht celebration every February, and I genuinely loved the place growing up. Still do in a way, but there's a hollow behind the main settlement that I will never go back to, and this is why. It was a September a few years back when my buddy Terrence and I decided to do a long weekend camping trip through the Monongahela National Forest. We'd been planning it on and off for most of the summer and finally got our acts together around Labor Day when work had settled down for both of us. Terrence is from Clarksburg and I'm from Elkins, so we met in the middle, packed his Tacoma with gear, and headed out Friday afternoon. The plan was pretty loose. We'd camp somewhere in the National Forest the first night, spend Saturday hiking around, maybe swing through Helvetia on Sunday morning to grab breakfast at the hot tub before heading home. Neither of us had any business being anywhere near what happened, is what I'm saying. We were just two guys trying to get some fresh air before fall really set in. We made camp Friday evening along the Rich Creek area, just off a forest road that Terrence knew about from a hunting trip he'd done years back. Nothing remarkable about that night. We cooked over the fire, had a couple of beers, went to bed at a reasonable hour. Saturday was genuinely great. We covered maybe 12 miles of trail, saw a black bear from a safe distance, and made it back to camp well before dark, feeling the specific kind of tired that only comes from actually using your body all day. It was Sunday morning when things got strange. We broke camp early and drove over toward Helvetia. I hadn't been there since my grandmother passed, which was going on 6 years at that point, and I was feeling a little sentimental about the whole thing. We got there around 8 in the morning, which was too early for the restaurant. We figured we'd kill some time walking around the village before it opened up. Terrence had never been to Helvetia before, and I was playing tour guide, showing him the old church, the little museum building, pointing out which houses were original Swiss settler construction versus newer stuff. It was a clear morning, cool, with that particular September light that makes everything look like a postcard. We were enjoying ourselves. I mentioned to Terrence that there was a hollow behind the main cluster of buildings that I remembered from when I was a kid. My grandmother had called it something in German or Swiss German. I couldn't remember what. She'd said the old settlers used to go there for something, some kind of seasonal ritual or ceremony, something rooted in whatever traditions they'd brought over from Europe. I'd always been curious about it as a kid, but we'd never actually gone back there. Terrence said that sounded interesting, and so we decided to take a look. The hollow itself isn't hard to find if you know roughly where to look. There's a little gap between two property lines at the back of the settled area where the land starts to drop off. And if you follow that downslope, you end up in this tight little valley. Old growth trees, mostly hemlock and beech, a small seasonal stream that was still running in September, the kind of place that doesn't get a lot of direct sunlight, even on a clear day, because the ridgelines on either side are steep enough to block it for most of the morning and afternoon. It was quiet in there, and I mean genuinely quiet, the kind of quiet where you notice it. We'd been walking through the forest all day Saturday, and it hadn't been silent the way this hollow was silent. No birds calling, no squirrels in the canopy, nothing moving in the underbrush. Just the faint sound of the little stream and our own footsteps on the leaf litter. About 100 yards into the hollow, I stopped. There were structures back there that I definitely did not remember from childhood. Whether they'd been there all along and I just hadn't paid attention at 8 or 9 years old, or whether they were newer, I honestly couldn't tell you. But there were 3 of them, low to the ground, built from stacked fieldstone without any mortar that I could see, maybe 2 feet high and roughly circular in shape, perhaps 4 or 5 feet across. They were spaced in a rough triangle, maybe 30 feet apart from one another. Each one had what looked like a depression or bowl shape in the center, the stones arranged so that the interior curved inward, like small wells that had been filled in, or like fire pits, but not quite either. Terrence crouched down and looked at one of them up close. He said he thought they were old, really old, based on how the lichen had grown over the stones, and the way the whole structure had partially settled into the earth. He said it looked like whatever they were, they'd been there for generations. I wasn't touching them. Something about the arrangement felt deliberate in a way that made me uncomfortable. Like whatever these were for, they weren't decorative. We spent maybe 5 minutes looking at the structures, and then I said we should head back. Terrence didn't argue. He'd gone quieter since we'd come down into the hollow, and I think he was feeling the same low-grade unease that I was. We were heading back up toward the village when Terrence stopped and grabbed my arm. There was a woman standing at the edge of the hollow, at the top of the slope, looking down at us. She was older, maybe late 70s, dressed in the kind of practical farm clothing you see on people who actually work. Outdoors, not the performed rural aesthetic you get at farmers markets in the city. Dark wool coat despite it being a reasonably warm morning. She was completely still and she was watching us. We both said hello. She didn't respond immediately, just kept looking at us for another few seconds. Then she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, in this very level, matter-of-fact tone, "You shouldn't have gone down there before speaking to someone first." I asked her what she meant. She said the hollow had a protocol, which was the exact word she used, a protocol, and that coming down here unannounced and without understanding what you were looking at wasn't a good idea. She wasn't angry about it. She wasn't even particularly alarmed. She just had the calm, certain manner of someone stating a practical fact. I asked her what the structures were. She paused for what felt like a long time before answering. Then she said they were for listening. I asked her what that meant, and she said the hollow had good acoustics, that certain sounds carried down into it from the ridgelines that you couldn't hear anywhere else, and that the old families had used those structures to hear things that needed to be heard. I didn't push it further than that. Neither did Terrence. We followed her back up out of the hollow, and she walked us to the edge of the settled area without saying anything else. Before she turned to go back to wherever she'd come from, she said, fairly casually, that we'd probably feel a little off for the next day or two and that it was nothing to worry about. It would pass. She was right. For about 48 hours after that visit, I had this persistent low-level feeling of wrongness, like something was slightly out of alignment with the world in a way I couldn't name. It wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't fear exactly. Just this persistent sensation that something nearby was paying attention. Terrence texted me Tuesday afternoon, 2 days after the trip, and said he'd been having strange dreams, but that they'd stopped the night before. I still don't know what those structures were. I've done some reading about Helvetia's history and about the traditions the original Swiss settlers brought with them to the hills of Randolph County. Some of what I found was interesting. Some of it I wasn't sure what to make of. But I've never gone back to that hollow, and I don't plan to. Story. This happened near Lost Creek in Harrison County, and I've been sitting on it for almost 3 years now because every time I tried to tell someone about it, I'd get about halfway through and then feel like an idiot. But I figure a place like this is as good as anywhere, so here goes. I work in natural gas pipeline inspection, which means I spend a significant portion of my working life driving down back roads in rural West Virginia, looking at infrastructure. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well. And I genuinely don't mind the solitude. I've put a lot of miles on a lot of back roads in this state, and I've gotten comfortable with the particular kind of quiet you find in the hill country at night. The road in question runs back off Route 18 just north of Lost Creek. In dead ends maybe 3 miles in at a compressor station that I check on a semi-regular basis. It's a well-maintained gravel road as pipeline roads go, well-marked and lit at the station end. But the stretch between the highway and the station runs through some hollows that are genuinely dark on a cloudy night. This was in November, a Wednesday, and I'd been called out for what turned out to be a false alarm reading from one of the sensors. I got there around 9 in the evening, walked the equipment, confirmed nothing was actually wrong, and then started back down the road toward the highway. About 1.5 miles from the highway, right where the road dips down through the lowest part of one of the hollows, I noticed light up on the ridgeline to my left. Now, people run trail cameras, spotlights, all kinds of things on private property out here. My first assumption was that somebody was out checking on something. Deer hunters do weird things at weird hours in November. I didn't think much of it. But then I watched the lights for a minute longer and I realized they weren't behaving right. There were 2 of them, roughly white or pale yellow, and they were moving, not scanning like a flashlight or a mounted spotlight, moving as a pair, staying the same distance from one another, traveling along the ridgeline at a pace that was faster than a person walking, but not as fast as a vehicle. And there wasn't any sound of an engine. The ridgeline up there was rocky and heavily wooded, not any kind of trail or access road that I'd ever noticed. I stopped the truck and rolled down the window. No engine noise, no voices, no sound from the ridge at all, just the lights moving. I watched them track along maybe a 1/4 mile of ridgeline before they stopped. Just stopped, both of them simultaneously, and stayed still. I sat there with my window down for probably 2 minutes, and they didn't move. I was starting to feel like I'd imagined the whole thing when they started moving again, only this time they were moving down the slope toward the hollow, coming toward the road. I rolled my window up and drove. I'm not proud of not sticking around, but whatever those lights were, they weren't behaving the way lights behave when they're attached to something that makes normal sense. The way they moved together, the consistency of the spacing, the way they went from fast movement to absolute stillness, and then back to movement again. It didn't sit right with me. I mentioned it to a guy I know who grew up in Harrison County, a guy who's been running these back roads his whole life, and he didn't seem particularly surprised. He said there were spots in the hollows around Lost Creek where people had been seeing things like that for as long as anyone could remember. He said his grandfather used to call them will-o-wisps in a casual way, like it was just a category of thing you knew existed in this part of the world, the same way you knew about sinkholes or copperheads. I don't know what they were. I've gone back down that road plenty of times since on inspection runs and never seen them again. But I keep the window up a little more often now when I'm driving the hollows at night. Story 3. The Woman in Droop Mountain. Before I get into this, I should say that I know Droop Mountain Battlefield State Park reasonably well. My family used to do the Civil War reenactment events there when I was growing up. My grandfather had a deep interest in the Battle of Droop Mountain, which was one of the last significant Civil War engagements on West Virginia soil. And from about the time I was 8 years old to when I was maybe 15, we went out there at least twice a year. I know the landscape. I know the trails. What I saw there when I went back as an adult is something I cannot explain within the context of that knowledge. I went back to Droop Mountain on a solo hike in October about 4 years ago. I was going through a rough stretch personally, nothing dramatic. Just one of those periods where everything feels slightly heavier than it should. And I'd found that getting out on trails by myself helped me reset. I'd picked Droop Mountain partly out of nostalgia and partly because I knew the trails well enough to hike without having to pay too much attention to navigation. It was a Tuesday and I had the park almost entirely to myself. The parking lot had one other car in it when I arrived. A minivan with a dog crate in the back that looked like it belonged to a family who'd been there earlier and already left. By the time I hit the trailhead, I was the only person I could see. The trails at Droop Mountain aren't long. The whole park covers about the battlefield area and a ridgeline with some overlooks. It's a couple of miles of maintained trail at most. I did the main loop, stopped at the overlooks, spent some time at the historical markers, thinking about my grandfather, and was heading back toward the parking lot, feeling genuinely better than I had in a while. This is where it happened. On the return section of the loop, where the trail runs back along the edge of the ridgeline through a stretch of mixed hardwoods, I came around a bend, and there was a woman on the trail, maybe 40 yards ahead of me. She was just standing there, off to the right side of the trail. Not on the trail itself, but right beside it, in a way that made me think she might be looking at something in the trees. Looking for a bird maybe, or watching a deer. I slowed down a little as I approached because I didn't want to startle her. As I got closer, I could see she was dressed in what looked like period clothing. Long, dark skirt, high-collared blouse, hair pinned up. My first thought was that she was some kind of living historian or park employee, although the reenactment season was over by October and there was nothing scheduled at the park that weekend that I was aware of. I got to within maybe 20 yards and said, "Excuse me," or something like that, just a standard trail greeting, and she turned toward me. I don't know how to describe what I saw in a way that will make sense. She looked like a person. She had the right proportions, the right features, a face with recognizable human geometry. But something was wrong with the way she registered visually. She was there in the same way everything else was there, but she was also somehow not quite as solid as the trees behind her. Not translucent exactly, just slightly wrong in a way that your brain recognizes immediately and sends a very loud signal about. She looked at me for a moment, and I was completely frozen on the trail. Then she turned back toward the trees and walked into them. Not around them, into them. I stood there for a long moment with my heart pounding in a way that hiking alone had never made it pound before. Then I walked, faster than I probably needed to, the remaining distance back to the parking lot, got in my car, and left. The area around Droop Mountain has a lot of history in terms of what happened there during the Civil War. A lot of loss, the kind of concentrated suffering that happened in a relatively small geographic area over a very short period of time. I've always been the kind of person who is skeptical about hauntings and that kind of thing. And I remain skeptical in general, but whatever I saw on that trail on that October afternoon, I can tell you it was not a living person. Story 4. Something in the store at Sinks Grove. Sinks Grove is a small community in Monroe County, in the southern part of the state. I used to pass through it regularly visiting family in the area, and there was an old general store there that had been in the same family for generations. The kind of place that also sold hardware and animal feed and whatever else the surrounding farms needed. I'd stopped in a handful of times over the years. The older gentleman who ran it was friendly and knew everyone in the county by name. This was a winter evening, maybe 5 o'clock, already dark because it was December, and I'd stopped in to pick up something on my way out to my relative's place. The store was empty except for the owner, who I'll just call Mr. H, and myself. I was up near the front counter paying for what I'd gotten when I heard something in the back of the store, past the shelving units, back in the section where they kept the hardware and the heavier farm supplies. A sound like something shifting or moving, boxes or shelving disturbed. Mr. H didn't react at all. He kept making change and telling me something about his son-in-law, completely unfazed. I assumed it was another customer I hadn't noticed when I came in, and I didn't think anything more of it. But then the sound happened again, only bigger this time. Not something shifting, something falling, a significant weight landing on a wooden floor. I looked at Mr. H. He paused in what he was saying, looked toward the back of the store, and then looked back at me and continued his sentence. I said, "You've got something moving around in the back there." He looked at me in a way that I can only describe as patient, like he was measuring something about the moment. Then he said, "Yeah, there's something back there. Has been since before my father's time. I asked him what he meant, and he said that whatever it was, it didn't bother anybody. It moved things sometimes, knocked things over, made a racket late at night when the store was closed. Sometimes badly enough that the neighbors would call him to check if there'd been a break-in. But it had never hurt anyone, and his family had long since learned to just let it do what it did. I asked if he'd ever tried to figure out what it was. He said his father had, back when he was a young man, and that whatever he found or didn't find had been enough to make him decide it wasn't worth investigating further. He never told anybody in the family what he'd seen, and as far as Mr. H knew, he'd taken it to his grave. He handed me my change, and then he said, fairly lightly, I'd recommend not going back there to look. I never go back there after dark, and I'd suggest you don't either. I thanked him and left. The store was closed the last time I passed through Sinks Grove. I don't know if it's because Mr. H retired or for some other reason, but I've thought about that conversation a lot. Specifically the way he said whatever it was, it didn't bother anybody. With that careful, particular phrasing. Like there was a line somewhere, and he understood where it was and had committed to not crossing it. If you've got a story from a rural community, a small town, a back road, or anywhere that gave you a feeling you can't quite explain, we want to hear it. Submit your story to Park Ranger Files, and it might be featured in an upcoming compilation. We read every single submission. Story. I don't know if you've done a story about Helvetia before, but I want to submit this because I've never told anyone about it, and I've been carrying it around for a long time. I was 17 years old when this happened, so it's been about 16 years now. I had a friend named Dara whose family had a farmhouse in the hills outside of Helvetia. Not in the village itself, but on a property about 2 miles up a dirt road from the main settlement. We used to spend weekends out there in the summers. Her parents were pretty laid back, and they liked having us around to help with basic chores in exchange for letting us have the run of the property and the surrounding forest. One night in August, Dara and I decided to walk down to the village and back. Not for any particular reason, it was just something to do. A couple of miles each way on a quiet country road on a warm night. We left around 9, walked down to Helvetia, walked around the village for maybe 20 minutes, and started back. Nothing unusual. It was a clear night and there was enough moonlight to see the road easily without flashlights. We were maybe half a mile from the farm, walking along a section of the road that ran along the edge of a woodlot when Dara grabbed my arm and made me stop. She pointed to the side of the road ahead of us, maybe 30 yards away. There was a figure there, standing at the tree line, not moving. My first thought was a person, a neighbor out for a late walk, or someone dealing with an animal issue on their property. But the more I looked at it, the less it looked like any of those things. It was tall, which I noticed after a moment, taller than any man I could think of, and the proportions weren't quite right. The silhouette against the tree line had a quality to it that made it hard to look at directly, like trying to read something in your peripheral vision that won't come into focus when you turn your head toward it. It was completely still, and it was facing us. Dara and I stood there for probably 30 seconds, which felt significantly longer. And then Dara said very quietly, "We should go." Not a question, a statement. We walked. We didn't run. I don't know why we didn't run exactly, I think, because running would have been an acknowledgement of the thing in a way that neither of us was ready to make. We kept our pace steady, and we didn't look back until we were through the farm gate and the house lights were in front of us. When I looked back from the gate, the road was empty. We didn't tell Dara's parents. We barely talked about it ourselves that night. In the morning, it felt like something we'd both agreed without discussing to classify as uncertain. As in, maybe it was a person and we just spooked ourselves and that was that. But I know what I saw. I know how tall it was. I know the way it was standing wasn't the way a person stands when they're just out for a walk on a country road at night. And I know that in 30 seconds of standing completely still in the line of sight of 2 teenagers, it made no move toward us, made no sound, gave no sign of any intention whatsoever. Whatever it was just watching. I've talked to a few people from that area since then, and more than one of them has mentioned something similar without me prompting them. Something tall at the edge of the woods, usually at night, usually just standing. One woman who grew up on a farm about 3 miles from where Dara's family had their place said her grandfather used to call it the Watcher in the local dialect, some German or Swiss word that I couldn't quite catch when she said it, and that the old families considered it part of the landscape of that particular part of the hills. Not something to be afraid of exactly, just something that was there. I don't know how to feel about that. I'm not sure it's comforting. Story 6. Seneca Rocks is one of the most visually dramatic spots in all of West Virginia. These enormous quartzite formations shooting up out of the Potomac River Valley. I'd been rock climbing there a number of times, and I knew the area reasonably well enough to be comfortable camping in the surrounding national forest on my own. This particular trip was a solo climb I'd been planning for most of the summer. I drove up from Charleston on a Thursday evening and set up camp in a designated spot in the Spruce Knob Seneca Rocks National Recreation Area. I had Friday and Saturday for climbing and would drive back Sunday morning. The campground I was at wasn't full, but wasn't empty either. Handful of other tents scattered around, a few families, a couple of other climbers I recognized from the parking area by their gear. Normal mid-August camping scene. What was not normal was the cabin. About a quarter mile from the main campground loop, visible from the trail that ran down to the climbing access area, there was a structure. I'd never noticed it on previous trips, and I couldn't tell from the trail whether it was an active structure or abandoned. Old logs, fairly small, set back from a clearing. It had the look of something that had been there a long time. Friday afternoon, after a solid day on the rock, I walked by it more carefully on my way back to camp. No car nearby. No signs of recent occupation that I could see from the trail. Curtained windows, no lights. I figured it was an old hunting cabin that someone still owned but didn't use regularly. That night I woke up at some point in the small hours. My watch said 3:40, to what I initially thought was my tent zipper moving in the wind. But there was no wind. And the sound wasn't outside the tent, it was right next to my head on the inside. The specific sound of a tent zipper being opened slowly. I was very still. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like a long time and heard nothing else. I told myself an animal had brushed against the tent from outside. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer, and the fabric had made that sound against the zipper. Possible. Not entirely convincing, but possible. In the morning, I looked at the zipper. It was fully open. The tab was hanging on the inside, which meant the zipper had been pulled inward from inside the tent. I zip my tents from inside when I go to sleep. For the zipper to have been opened by an animal from outside, the animal would have had to have somehow pulled the tab from the outside through the material. Which doesn't make sense. I told myself I must have opened it in my sleep. Also possible. Less convincing. I was climbing again all day Saturday and had a good enough time that I pushed the zipper incident down below the level of active concern. But that night around midnight, I woke up again. And this time what woke me was not a sound from inside the tent. It was a light from the direction of the old cabin. I could see it through the tent fabric, a warm yellowish glow that flickered like candlelight. I unzipped my tent, this time consciously, and looked out. The cabin had light in its windows, curtained, diffuse, unmistakable. I sat there for about 10 minutes watching it. No movement outside the cabin, no sound from that direction, no vehicles in the area. Then the light went out, all at once. Not the gradual fade of a candle being blown out. Just gone. I went back to sleep because what else are you going to do at midnight? In the morning, I walked over to the cabin and looked at it up close. The windows had heavy curtains that had blocked any view inside. The door was padlocked from the outside, an old padlock with significant rust on it. that did not look like it had been opened recently. There was no sign of anyone having been there. No tire tracks in the soft ground around it. No footprints beyond my own. I mentioned it to the camp host when I stopped in to return my permit tag, and she said she'd had other campers mention lights in the cabin before. She said she had no idea who owned it or whether it had been occupied in the last 50 years. She said she'd reported it to the Forest Service a couple of times, and they'd looked into it but hadn't found anything explanatory. She said it with the slightly weary tone of someone who has learned to accept that some things in these hills don't resolve themselves neatly. Story 7. The House Above Poca. My family owned a piece of property up in the hills above the Poca area in Putnam County that had been in the family since before my grandparents were born. Old timberland mostly, some of it cleared over the years for a small pasture, a creek running through the lower part. There was a house on it, built sometime in the early 1900s, that my grandmother grew up in and that various relatives had lived in and out of over the decades. By the time I was in my 20s, the house had been empty for about 12 years. The last person who had lived there was my great-uncle Bern, who had moved to a nursing home in Hurricane when his health declined, and nobody had done anything with the property since. It wasn't being sold, it wasn't being rented, it was just sitting there. My cousin Ruth Ann and I decided one spring to go up and check on the place. Not with any plan to fix it up or anything like that, just to see how it was holding together and to clear out any personal effects before weather or wildlife made that impossible. The drive up the property road took about 20 minutes from the paved road, and even in a capable vehicle, it was slow going in a couple of spots. When we pulled up to the house, it looked better than I'd expected. The roof had some obvious wear, but hadn't caved. The porch was intact. Trees and shrubs had moved in close on all sides, but hadn't taken over the structure itself. Ruth Ann had the key, and we let ourselves in. The inside was exactly what you'd expect from a house that hadn't been inhabited in 12 years. Dust on every surface. A smell of old wood and closed air and something faintly animal. Furniture still in place, which was slightly eerie, like the occupant had just stepped out. My great-uncle had taken his personal belongings to the nursing home, but hadn't had anyone clear the household items. So the kitchen still had plates in the cupboard, and there was still a clock on the mantelpiece that had stopped. We spent a couple of hours going through things and making notes of what might be worth salvaging, taking some photos. It was sad in the way old family places always are, not frightening. Ruth Ann found some old photographs in a dresser drawer, and we spent a while going through those, identifying people. It was late afternoon when I went up to check the second floor. Ruth Ann had stayed downstairs to continue going through the front room. The stairs were solid, which surprised me. I went up and did a quick walk through the two small bedrooms and the narrow hallway that connected them. Both rooms were empty of furniture, which meant my great-uncle had used only the first floor in his later years. Just bare plank floors and old wallpaper coming away from the walls in long, curling strips. I was standing in the second bedroom, looking out the window at the overgrown garden below when I heard footsteps. Not from downstairs where Ruth Ann was. From the other bedroom. Directly across the narrow hallway from where I was standing. Clear, deliberate footsteps on a wooden floor. A person's weight, distributed the way a person's weight distributes through a foot and then a heel, traveling from one side of the room to the other. I stepped into the hallway. The other bedroom door was ajar, the way I'd left it when I'd checked it 10 minutes earlier. I pushed it fully open. Empty. Nothing there. The room was exactly as it had been when I'd stood in it 10 minutes earlier. I went back downstairs and told Ruth Ann what I'd heard. She looked at me for a moment and then said, very matter-of-factly, I heard walking upstairs the whole time you were up there. I figured it was just the house settling in the heat of the afternoon. I said, Ruth Ann, that I was standing still when I heard the footsteps. I was standing at the window in the far bedroom. What I heard was footsteps in the other bedroom, the empty one. She didn't say anything to that, We packed up what we were taking and left while there was still daylight. We've talked about it a few times since, and neither of us has a satisfying explanation. Old houses make sounds, that's not a mystery. But footsteps with weight and deliberateness and purpose, crossing a room that was empty when I looked into it a moment later, that's not a house settling in the afternoon heat. Something was in that house with us, and I'm glad we didn't stay past dark to find out more about what it was. If you grew up in West Virginia or spent time in its small communities and you've got a story you've been sitting on, Park Ranger Files wants to hear it. Every story is read personally, and we never share your name without permission. Story 8, The Girl from Lewisburg. I'm a nurse and I've been working at the hospital in Lewisburg for going on 11 years. I want to be clear before I say anything else that I'm a practical person. I did not come into this profession with any tolerance for magical thinking. You can't. But what happened to me on a Tuesday morning 2 Novembers ago has no practical explanation, and I've made peace with the fact that it probably never will. I was driving into an early shift. It was before 7, still dark, and I was coming in along a back road that shaves about 6 minutes off the drive from where I live east of town. I'd driven it 100 times. There was a girl standing in the road. She was maybe 12 or 13 years old, wearing a light jacket that was not appropriate for a 35-degree November morning. She was standing directly in the center of my lane about 40 yards ahead with her arms at her sides, looking at my headlights. I stopped. I put on my hazards. I got out of the car. She hadn't moved. She was still standing there, lit by my headlights, looking at me with an expression I can only describe as serious. Not scared, not confused. Serious, like she'd been waiting for this. And she knew exactly what she was doing. I asked her if she was okay. She said she needed help. I asked her where her parents were. She said they were in the house, and the house was wrong. I asked her what she meant by wrong, and she said there was something in the house that wasn't supposed to be there. I did what I was trained to do. I called 911, and I kept talking to her. I asked her name, and she told me. I asked her what road she lived on, and she pointed back the way I'd come, toward a gravel turnoff that I'd passed without thinking about it. I walked her to the passenger side of my car, got her seated and warm, and told the dispatcher what I had. Deputies got there within 12 minutes. By this point, the girl was calm and talking normally, just cold and clearly shaken under the surface calm. They went to the house. I won't go into details about what they found because it involves a real family, and it wouldn't be right to put their situation out there for strangers to read about. What I can tell you is that what they found in that house was serious. Serious enough that what happened next involved multiple agencies, and the girl did not return to that house. What I think about is this. That girl was standing in the middle of a back road in the dark at 6:40 in the morning in a light jacket. If I hadn't been coming in early for a shift change, if I had taken the highway the way I usually do in bad weather, she would have been standing there alone. The nearest house other than her own was half a mile in either direction. She told me later when I checked on her through the caseworker who'd been assigned that she'd been standing in that road for over an hour before my headlights appeared. I don't know what made me take that road that morning. I hadn't planned to. I just turned onto it without thinking about it. The way you sometimes do when your mind is on other things and your hands just go where they've gone before. I choose to believe that something made me go that way. I don't know what, but I'm grateful for it every single day. Story 9. Arthurdale is a historic community in Preston County, the first New Deal homestead project in the country. Eleanor Roosevelt was involved in its founding. There's real history there, and it's been studied and written about extensively. But there's something else there that nobody in the academic literature seems to have mentioned. I grew up in Preston County and spent plenty of time around Arthurdale as a kid and teenager. The community itself is well maintained and the historical buildings are preserved. It's not a spooky place in any conventional sense, but the land around it, particularly the sections that border the older farming hollows to the south, has a quality to it that I noticed from a young age and could never quite explain. The best way I can describe it is that the ground there sounds hollow in places. I know that sounds like a mundane geological observation. Karst topography, limestone dissolution, that kind of thing. West Virginia has plenty of cave systems and areas where the ground is genuinely hollow underneath. I understand that, but this is something different from a geological standpoint, or at least it presents differently. In certain spots in the hollows south of Arthurdale, if you stop and listen carefully, you can hear sounds coming from beneath your feet. Not the sound of underground water, which has a recognizable character. These are different, lower, rhythmic in a way that underground water is not. My father heard it when I pointed it out to him the first time I showed him, when I was about 10 and he would have been in his late 30s. He stood there for a good minute just listening, and then he said it sounded like someone knocking. He wasn't wrong. It does sound like someone knocking. A slow, steady knock, irregular enough to not be mechanical, regular enough to seem intentional. It comes from maybe 20 or 30 feet below the surface, roughly if you're judging by sound alone. I've asked around about this over the years. Older residents of the area tend to react to the question in two ways. Either they know exactly what I'm talking about and get a little closed off about it, or they look at me like I've said something wrong. One woman who'd lived in the area her whole life and was in her 80s when I talked to her said her mother had told her the sounds were from the old workers. She meant coal miners, I think, from the mines that operated in the surrounding hills in the early 20th century. She said her mother believed they were the sounds of the men who died in the mines and hadn't found their way out. I don't know how to evaluate that. I do know that the coal history of Preston County includes more than a few mining disasters, the kind where not all the men were recovered. The sounds are still there. I went back 2 summers ago and stood in the same spot I've stood in since I was a child and listened. Still knocking, still rhythmic, still coming from underneath. Story 10. The dog that came from the mountain. This is the shortest story that I have to tell, and in some ways, it's the one that bothers me the most. I live in a small community in Nicholas County. We have about 40 families within a couple of miles of each other, some further out on private land. It's quiet. Everybody knows everybody, or at least knows of everybody. About 2 years ago, a dog appeared in the community. It wasn't anyone's dog. We knew that immediately because this community is the kind of place where everybody's animals are known to everybody else. This was a large dog, mixed breed, darker in color, that appeared one morning in the field next to the Caulfield's place and started moving through the community. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't bark. It didn't approach people in a way that seemed threatening or even particularly friendly. It just moved through, like it was looking for something or going somewhere, passing from property to property in a way that covered the whole community over the course of that day. My neighbor Len said it came through his yard around noon, walked the full length of his fence line, stopped at the corner and looked back toward the mountain for a full minute, and then moved on. By evening, it had covered most of the community, and then it went back to the mountain, as far as anyone could tell. 3 days later, one of the older men in the community, a man named Mr. Patton, who'd been out here his whole life, had a cardiac event and passed away at the county hospital. People talked about the dog then, about how it had passed through, about how it had seemed to be checking on something. I wouldn't have thought anything of it. Stray dog, sad coincidence. Except that 4 months later, the dog came back. Same dog, same behavior. Moving through the community, methodical, not aggressive, not friendly, just present, covering the same rough circuit. And 2 weeks after that, we lost another longtime resident, a woman named Jeranine, who'd lived out here since she was born. After the second time, people started watching for the dog. Not in a fearful way, more in a paying attention way. Like they'd recognized a pattern and wanted to know what it meant. It has come through 4 times in the last 2 years. After each visit, within 2 to 4 weeks, someone from the community has died. Older residents, all of them, all of natural causes. No young people, no accidents. Just the older folks passing. Some people in the community think the dog is a warning. Some think it's something else. One of the older women said she'd heard of this before. A dog that comes from the hills when it's time, and that as long as it didn't stop on your property specifically and look at your door, you had nothing to worry about. I don't know what the dog is. I've never seen it myself. Only heard about it from neighbors, but I'll be honest with you. I watched the field next to the Caulfield's place a little more carefully than I used to. Story 11. The tunnel at Thurmond is the famously near-abandoned railroad town in the New River Gorge. Most people who've been there know it from the national park context. The historic depot, the old buildings, the dramatic gorge setting. What fewer people know about is what's in the hill above the town. I grew up in Fayette County, and we used to go down to Thurmond as teenagers because it had that quality of spectacular desolation that appeals to 16-year-olds. Old buildings, dramatic scenery, minimal adult supervision. There were a few residents still living there, but not enough to make the place feel populated. Behind and above the town proper, if you climb the slope on the north side, there's an old tunnel or adit cut into the hill. Not railroad related as far as anyone I've ever talked to has been able to determine. Just a horizontal shaft going back into the rock, maybe 40 or 50 feet, shored up with timber that was old when we found it. No indication on any map I've ever looked at of what it was for or when it was dug. We went into it once, one afternoon when we were probably 17. Me and 2 friends, Danny and Kevin, both of whom I'm still in touch with. The first 30 feet or so were unremarkable. Just an old mine shaft, rough stone walls, the smell of damp earth. The timbers were more solid than they looked from outside, which was reassuring. It was when we got to the back of the shaft that we stopped. At the very end, carved into the stone of the back wall, were marks. A lot of marks, not random graffiti. Not anything in any recognizable language. A dense arrangement of lines and shapes that covered the full back wall from floor to ceiling. Some of the marks looked very old, worn smooth by time. Others looked fresher, cut more recently into the same wall, as if people had been coming back to this place over a period of years or decades to add to whatever was there. Danny took pictures on a disposable camera he had with him. When he got the film developed, most of the pictures from the tunnel were underexposed because we'd only had flashlights, but a couple came out well enough to show the marks on the wall. I wish I still had those pictures. Danny thinks he might have them somewhere in his parents' basement, but we haven't been able to find them. What I remember about the marks is that they weren't random. There was a system to them, a repetition of certain elements, a density that suggested meaning. Not any written language I recognize or have since recognized in any reference, but clearly intentional, clearly organized, clearly put there by multiple people over a long period of time. We didn't stay long after we found the wall. Something about being in a closed space, looking at something you don't understand, that has clearly been significant to other people in a way you can't access. It has a particular quality of discomfort that's hard to articulate, but very easy to feel. I've been back to Thurmond many times since as an adult. I've hiked up the slope a few times looking for the tunnel entrance. I've either missed it because vegetation has overgrown it, or it's been deliberately closed off, but I haven't been able to find it in the last 10 years. Danny says he's had dreams about the marks. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where he's in a room he doesn't recognize, and someone is explaining to him what the marks mean. He says he can almost understand in the dream, but never quite gets there before he wakes up. Park Ranger Files drops new stories every week. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. The stories that stay with you longest are usually the ones from the places nobody talks about. Story 12. Route 219 runs through some of the most beautiful and remote country in West Virginia, from the Maryland state line down through Pocahontas County and into Greenbrier County. I've driven it many times. It's one of those roads where you can go 30 or 40 minutes without seeing another vehicle and you don't feel like anything's wrong. You just feel like you're somewhere genuinely far from everything. This was a late afternoon in March, still light, but the light that's getting long and golden and warning you that dark is maybe an hour away. I was coming south through Pocahontas County, no particular hurry, enjoying the drive. Just south of Marlinton, I passed a family on the roadside. Mother, father, 3 children, oldest maybe 10, youngest maybe 5. They were standing in a loose cluster on the right shoulder of the road. No car that I could see, no breakdown visible anywhere. The father was looking down the road in the direction I'd come from. The mother was looking the other way, south. The children were just standing there. I slowed considerably when I passed them. All 5 of them turned and looked at my vehicle as I went by. None of them raised a hand or signaled in any way. None of them looked distressed in any obvious way. They just watched me pass. I went another half mile trying to decide what to do, and then pulled over and turned around. You don't leave a family with young children on the side of a back road in Pocahontas County in March, an hour before dark, without at least checking on them. When I got back to where they'd been standing, the shoulder was empty. I pulled over and looked around. There was no turn, no driveway, no gap in the guardrail. The terrain on both sides of the road was steep and heavily wooded. There was nowhere they could have gone in 30 seconds. Not a whole family with children, not without leaving traces in the vegetation on the bank. I sat there for a while. I got out of my car and walked the shoulder in both directions for a couple of 100 yards. Nothing. I drove on, shaken. I've thought about practical explanations. A driveway I missed, a vehicle that came and picked them up in the 30 seconds I was turned around and driving back. But a driveway in that stretch of 219 would have been visible, and any vehicle coming from either direction while I was turning around would have had its headlights on, which I would have seen. The most unsettling detail is the way they all looked at my car as I passed. Not with any expression I could read as distress or relief or anything that matched the situation of a stranded family. Just watching. All 5 of them in the same moment, turning to look. I've mentioned this to a few people over the years. Most people have a practical explanation ready. One person, an older woman from Pocahontas County, didn't have a practical explanation. She said there were families in that part of the road that you see sometimes, and that they'd been there for a long time. She said seeing them wasn't necessarily a bad sign. It just meant the road was taking note of you. I don't know what that means, but it's what she said. Story 13. Cranberry Glades Botanical Area in Pocahontas County is one of the most unusual places in West Virginia. It's a series of sphagnum bogs at high elevation, a southern extension of the boreal ecosystem, the kind of place where insectivorous plants grow and the ground shakes like a waterbed when you walk on the boardwalk, because there's nothing solid below the peat. Signs everywhere warn you to stay on the boardwalk and not step off into the bog because the peat is deep and unstable. I did a research survey out there years ago when I was working toward my ecology degree and have been back a number of times since out of personal interest. It's genuinely one of my favorite places in the state, but there's something wrong with the far end of the South Glades after dark. I know I shouldn't have been out there after dark. I know the boardwalk isn't meant for night visits. I was young and I thought I was being adventurous and I had good lights and I wasn't doing anything in the bog itself, just walking the boardwalk. I've done stupider things. It was the smell that came first. Not the normal smell of the bog, which is sulfurous and earthy and has its own particular character that you get used to quickly. This was something else. Something underneath the bog smell, colder with a quality that I've since struggled to find a comparison for. The closest I can get is that it smelled like the inside of something very old, like the smell of geologic time, if that means anything to anyone. The smell arrived ahead of a change in the sound. The bogs are not silent at night. There are insects and frogs and whatever else lives in that ecosystem, doing their things in the dark. Normal ambient biological noise that I was aware of as background. It stopped. All of it simultaneously, like someone had thrown a switch. Silence. Complete. Total. The kind where your own breathing seems unreasonably loud. I stood on the boardwalk in the dark with my headlamp and listened to nothing. Then something broke the surface of the bog water about 20 feet off the boardwalk to my left. Not dramatically, not with any splash or noise. Something came up from below the surface and was now above it, dark against the dark water, and I could see it only because my headlamp caught the water moving around whatever it was. It was large. Larger than any animal I could identify as having business in a cranberry glade at midnight. And it was still, completely still, just present on the surface of the water. I walked off the south end of the boardwalk and back to the parking area at a pace that I would describe as controlled panic. I didn't run because I was on an unlit boardwalk over unstable peat in the dark, and falling off would have been significantly worse than whatever was in the water behind me. In the morning, I went back and walked the full boardwalk in daylight and looked at the bog surface in the area where I'd seen the thing. There was nothing. No disturbance to the peat, no indication of anything having moved through that part of the glades. Just bog. Just sundews and pitcher plants and sphagnum moss and still dark water. I don't go to cranberry glades after dark anymore. Some places are meant to be daytime places. Story 14. The Church Above Elkins. There's a very old church on a hillside outside of Elkins that I'm not going to identify more specifically than that because I have no desire to send people up there. It's been abandoned for as long as I've been alive and probably longer. White clapboard, small, the kind of rural church that was the center of a small community that no longer exists as such. I went to the church for the first time when I was in my mid-20s with a friend who'd heard about it from someone at work. We drove up the access road, which was barely navigable, and walked up the slope to the church building itself. The building was in better shape than I expected. The roof had a significant hole near the back, but the front section was largely intact. All the windows were out, which let weather in, but the basic structure was solid. Old wooden pews still inside, a few still upright, most tilted or collapsed. An old pulpit at the front, and at the back, near the hole in the roof, a section of collapsed ceiling and flooring from whatever room had been above. We spent maybe an hour exploring the building, nothing remarkable except the atmosphere of the place, which was heavy in a way that was hard to ignore. Old churches have a weight to them when they've been abandoned, a sense of something unresolved. What was remarkable was the cemetery behind the church. Most rural churches in West Virginia have cemeteries. You expect them. But this one was different from any I'd seen before. The headstones were of a uniform style that I couldn't place in any tradition I was familiar with. No crosses, no stars of David, no obelisks or urns. Each stone was a low, flat slab, set nearly flush with the ground, with markings on the surface. Names and dates on some, though many of the dates were very old, 1800s, a few going back earlier than that. On others, there were no names or dates, just symbols. The symbols were the same as, or very similar to, what I'd seen described by someone who'd been in the Thurman Tunnel. Not that I'd connected those stories at the time. This was years before the Thurman story was told to me. But when I heard that story later, I thought immediately of the cemetery behind the abandoned church above Elkins. Lines and shapes that weren't any alphabet I recognized. Repeated elements, a system. My friend and I spent a long time in that cemetery. trying to make sense of the markings. We took photographs. We didn't touch anything. On the drive home, my friend said that the cemetery had given her the feeling that the people buried there were still expecting something. Not restless, she specified. Not unhappy. Just waiting. I've thought about that description many times. The cemetery behind the abandoned church is the only graveyard I've ever been in that didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause. Story 15. Bartow is barely a town. A few dozen people, a church, an old store, a post office, a scattering of houses in the Greenbrier River Valley in Pocahontas County. It's the kind of place you drive through on the way to somewhere else and might not notice. I ended up stranded there once after my truck broke down on Route 28, and the tow wouldn't make it out until morning. The woman who owned the house nearest to where I'd pulled off offered me a spare room for the night. I'm from West Virginia, and I know how people out here treat strangers in need, so this wasn't surprising. I thanked her and accepted. She was in her late 60s, lived alone, had the calm, rooted manner of someone who's been in the same place their whole life and doesn't feel any particular need to explain themselves to anyone. She fed me dinner, and we talked for a while in the kitchen. She was knowledgeable about the area's history, the old railroad operations along the Greenbrier, the farming families that had been there for generations, the ways the valley had changed over the decades. Around 9, she showed me to the spare room and said goodnight. A small room, neat, with a window looking out toward the back of the property and the hillside beyond. I lay there in the dark, trying to sleep, and found that I couldn't. Not for any specific reason, just that particular restlessness you get in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar place. I lay there for an hour or so, watching the window lighten and darken with clouds passing over whatever moon was up. At some point around 11, I heard the door to the house open, the front door which I'd come in through, and then footsteps in the hallway, and then a voice. Multiple voices, actually, but quiet. The kind of quiet that's deliberate rather than accidental. The murmur of conversation from somewhere in the front part of the house. I lay still and listened and couldn't make out words. Just the fact of voices. More than one. Definitely not the television. I didn't know whether to be concerned or not. Maybe she had family that had stopped by late. Maybe neighbors. It wasn't my house and it wasn't my business. The voices went on for about 40 minutes and then went quiet. The front door opened and closed again, and then there was just the silence of the house. In the morning over coffee, I almost didn't say anything. But I mentioned that I'd heard her having visitors late in the evening, and I hoped it hadn't been anything serious. She looked at me with an expression that was thoughtful rather than surprised. She said, "Those aren't visitors exactly." She said there were people who came to the house sometimes at night that she didn't fully have words for, that they'd been coming since before she lived there, since before the previous family had lived there, that they came when something needed attending to in the valley, when something was going to change or had just changed, and that she'd learned over the years that the right thing to do was to let them in, give them whatever space they needed, and let them go. I asked her if they were dangerous. She thought about that for a moment and then said, no. But she added that she'd never made the mistake of trying to see them clearly, that there was a difference between letting something have the space it needed and making it the object of your attention, and that she'd learned that difference early. I paid her for the room, which she tried to refuse, and then waited out front for the tow. The truck pulled up, we got my vehicle sorted, and I was on the road by 10. On the drive home, I thought about what she'd said about the difference between letting something have space and making it the object of your attention. I've thought about that distinction many times since, in all kinds of contexts. Whatever comes into that house in Bartow at night, she understood something about it that I don't. And I think she understood something else too, which is that some things in these old valleys have been here longer than any of us and will be here long after. And the most you can do is figure out how to share the space with them in a way that works for everyone involved. I don't know if that's wisdom or accommodation, but it's something. That's all for today's compilation. If any of these stories felt familiar, or if you grew up somewhere in the state and you've got something in your memory you've never said out loud, we want to hear it. Submit your story through the link in the description, and we'll see you next time.